Thank you. We're going to finish off Kings today, and we have some really important topics. We have to talk about the Abrahamic covenant because this whole thing, the whole Old Testament, kind of hangs off of the Abrahamic covenant. And then we're going to talk about the importance of the historical part that we're going to deal with this week, the scattering, which then leads us to the gathering. We're going to talk about Hezekiah, Manasseh, Josiah, and then the destruction of Jerusalem. Let's talk about the Abrahamic covenant. On the one side of the Abrahamic covenant, the Lord picked a family. That was Abraham and his family, and he wanted him to proclaim the gospel or his words or his name or his existence to all the world. And if he did that, then he would be preserved, protected. He would get priesthood power, posterity, and a plot of land, a place. Now, the plot of land is very, very interesting if you look at it. What's so interesting about Canaan, Israel?
It's kind of central, isn't it?
Yeah, it's right smack dab in the middle, and it's at the crossroads of the East and the West. If you're going to have someone proclaim your name and advertise for you, then that'd be the place to go. That's where you're going to put your big billboard up. Now, the problem with the Abrahamic covenant is that he's always very faithful to his side of it, but we oftentimes get lackadaisical in our part of the Abrahamic covenant. And that's basically what happens this week in the scriptures.
For it appears that the house of Israel, sooner or later, will be scattered upon all the face of the earth, and also among all nations.
And behold, there are many who are already lost from the knowledge of those who are at Jerusalem. Yea, the more part of all the tribes have been led away, and they are scattered to and fro upon the isles of the sea. And whether they are, none of us know, save that we know that they have been led away. Now, how can Nephi say that? How is he able to so determinately say there's already a whole bunch have been lost?
Well, he studied the Old Testament.
Well, yeah, he lived through, or his ancestors lived through, the first dispersal, and then he was part of the group that was led away. So there was two ways to get dispersed. Either you got dragged away or you got led away. And of course, they got led away, which was kind of the better way to go. I'm going to slip into Chronicles here for a moment because I don't know if you're aware, but from Deuteronomy all the way to Second Kings, it has a particular flavor. And it's written in a particular way to support Deuteronomy and the law of Moses and the kings. And then when you get into Chronicles and some of the stuff afterwards, it doesn't have that same flavor. But if you go into Chronicles, this is chapter 30 of Chronicle, it gives you some ancillary information that's kind of important. We have here in chapter 30, Hezekiah. And what do you know about Hezekiah as a king? Anything? Good guy. Yeah, he's one of the good guys. And he does some excellent work with having people do the right things. He does something that's really interesting. He sends a letter to all of Israel.
So the posts went with the letters from the king and his princes throughout all Israel and Judah, and according to the commandment of the king, saying, Ye children of Israel, turn again unto the Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, and he will return to a remnant of you that are escaped out of the hand of the kings of Assyria.
And so what's happened here is that the northern kingdom has already been subjected to Assyria, and some of the cream of those people have been taken away, but the majority of the people have not been. If you saw my Sunday broadcast, you will know that the Assyrian had a 3-level of conquest. And the top level of conquest was that just pay us tribute and you'll be fine. It was like protection money. And the second level, which Israel has now gone through, is if you don't pay, then they come and they kind of beat up and take away some of the more intelligent people and some of your military. That they have a kind of a brain drain they take away, and then they leave the rest. And then the third one is a wholesale massacre of a third of the population, or however much it is. And so in this one, Hezekiah is saying to the northern kingdom, if you guys would just repent and turn back to the Lord, you can still be saved. You don't have to be destroyed. But what happens is in verse 10, so they send this post to through all of the country, particularly to Ephraim and Manasseh, who were kind of the leading tribes, even unto Zebulun, but they laughed them to scorn and mocked them. So it was kind of this last ditch attempt for the Lord to rescue the northern kingdom, and they laughed him to scorn. Nevertheless, some of Asher, and then you'll notice that I underlined Manasseh and Zebulun, humbled themselves and came to Israel. Why do you think I underlined Manasseh there?
Because Lehi came from the Manasseh group.
Yeah. And there's
that's how Lehi's family ended up being in Jerusalem.
That's the speculation, is that some of the righteous people from the northern kingdom, rather than be taken away and become part of the 10 lost tribes, relocated. Most of them didn't. Most of them laughed and said, you guys are nuts. But some few people, obviously Lehi's family, participated. And so then we get the 10 tribes being taken away in about 721 BC. Again, the author, whoever that is, of Kings, is very clear to indicate that the reason this happened was that they stopped worshiping the Lord in the way that they should have, that they feared other gods, and they had mixed their culture with the other cultures. And so the Lord said, basically, if you want to be like everybody else, guess what? Off you go. You can be like everybody else. And they get dragged into Assyria. This was an interesting article that I found in a book called The Miracle of Freedom. And in this book, Chris Stewart, and I think his brother also helped him write it, he indicated that throughout the lifetime of the world, does anybody know approximately how many people have lived on the earth? There's some educated guesses that it's been total population 100 billion. Chris says that only 5% in that whole time of the earth lived under what we would call a state of freedom. And most lived in a very undemocratic kind of system. If the term terrorism could apply to any regime, it certainly would apply to the Assyrian method of conquest, for they were as savage as any regime known in the history of man. Their policy, described with a bit of understated passiveness as calculated frightfulness, had proven very effective. Yet it was fairly straightforward. In order to weaken a nation's major cities or capitals, its smaller towns and lesser cities were assaulted. Note that the Assyrian record quoted at the beginning of this chapter describes the 46 of Hezekiah's strong walled cities, as well as the small towns in the area that were destroyed before the army fell upon Jerusalem. After they took away the northern kingdom, and after Jerusalem decided they didn't want to pay any more taxes, Judah decided that they would rebel, they subjugated 46 walled cities. The only one they didn't get was Jerusalem. So Jerusalem was the only city that wasn't subjugated. Brutality then reigned. A captured city was usually plundered and burnt to the ground. Its site was deliberately denuded by killing its trees. The loyalty of the troops was secured by dividing a large part of the spoils among them. Their bravery was ensured by the general rule of the Near East that all captives in war might be enslaved or slain. Soldiers were rewarded for every severed head they brought in from the field, so that the aftermath of a victory generally witnessed the wholesale decapitation of fallen foes. When I was reading it, I decided to put just this light version in. The heavy version is very dramatic. And generally speaking, what would occur in the Assyrian domination of an area, if you went all the way to the third stage, is they killed a third of the people, just straight out killed them. They took away a third of the people as captives, and a third, usually the low end of society, the poor, the uneducated, they left in that area. And then they imported people from other areas that had been subjugated and mixed them in there. So that's how we get the Samaritans, is when the northern tribes get taken away, they bring back a bunch of people from other areas and mix them in there. And that's why there was such animosity between the kingdom of Judah and the Samaritans, because it was the Jewish religion mixed with all kinds of other religions. And so it was really kind of a brutal sort of a conquest. The scattering of Israel. If you want further information on this, you can look at 2nd Nephi is replete with some of the things of the scattering of Israel and the gathering of Israel, which is kind of interesting because of all the scriptures that we least like to read, 2nd Nephi is right up there, right? Nobody wants to read Second Nephi because it's full of Isaiah. And yet understanding this is critical for us to understand what the prophet today is talking about. Because if we don't understand the scattering, how will we understand the gathering? And so we have here many different scatterings that go on.
The house of Israel was scattered on several occasions. The first was in 721 BC when the Assyrian Empire scattered the northern 10 tribes. The second was in 586 BC when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem and relocated many of the Jews. Finally, in AD 70, the Romans burned down the temple in Jerusalem and sold much of the Jewish population into slavery, as Nephi prophesied would happen. However, Nephi also knew from Isaiah that someday God would set up an ensign for the nations, and shall assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. The Book of Mormon makes it clear that the gathering will be a physical event, and that scattered Israel would be gathered in from their long dispersion from the isles of the sea and from the four parts of the earth to the lands of their inheritance.
Thank you. Lehi, for example, seems to equate being gathered with coming to a knowledge of the Messiah. He stated that after the house of Israel should be scattered, they should be gathered together again or come to the knowledge of the true Messiah, their Lord and their Redeemer. So part of this gathering has to do with the house of Israel, the Jewish nation, the Jewish people coming to a knowledge of Jesus being the Christ. And then a very clear statement from President Nelson. Anytime you do anything that helps anyone on either side of the veil take a step toward making covenants with God and receiving their essential baptismal and temple ordinances, you're helping to gather Israel. It's as simple as that. And so that's why you can see that the church has such an emphasis on temple work and on missionary work and on helping those who are around us see what the light of Christ is all about, to bring people unto Christ. Okay, let's talk about Hezekiah. Hezekiah walks into a situation where strike one has already happened, and they're already in subjection to Assyria and having to pay some very formidable taxes. And then Hezekiah decides that they don't need to do that anymore. But then Assyria looks like they're coming down to pound on them. And so he talks to Isaiah, and Isaiah says, "Be not afraid." And one of the most famous things that Hezekiah does is when he's in this troubled state, he goes to the temple to pray, to ask for help. And his prayer, if you want to read it in 2 Kings 19 and 20, is very heartrending. He just pours his soul out to the Lord, begging for his help and for deliverance. Now, the reason he would do that is because, as we talked about previously, all the area around Jerusalem had been totally subjugated. There is historic evidence, archaeological evidence of the destruction of a town called Lachish, which was one of the largest towns outside of Jerusalem. The reliefs that are shown here on the right are the depictions of the destruction of this city. Parts of the depiction show Assyrian archers and stone throwers, Judean soldiers being impaled, and later scenes of people being led from the defeated city into exile. So according to these surveys, the Assyrians decimated virtually all of the countryside outside of Jerusalem. It was leveled and burnt, and the people were taken away. And so here's the Assyrian army surrounding Jerusalem, and they're saying, okay, you guys better surrender. That would have been hugely traumatic. And we have one of the chief civil servants standing before the people, telling them how silly they are, shouting at the people on the walls that they should just surrender, that God's not going to save them. The gods of all these other places didn't save them, and you're not going to be saved. And so it's kind of interesting because the guy who was the chief civil servant, he could speak the local dialect, Judean, and he knew of the customs of the people. And so he was able to use this knowledge to work almost a psychological warfare on the people, to tell them that they were being crazy, that they needed to just surrender. And the fact that he could speak the Judean language was upsetting to them. So the leaders asked him not to speak in their local dialect, but that they should speak in Aramaic, in the language of Syria. And part of the reason that they did that was they didn't want the people around to hear all that was going on and to be frightened. This senior councilman stood up and shouted even louder in the Jews' language to tell them all that's going to befall them to try to scare the people. Now, we know what happens, or maybe not everybody does. Rod, what happens to this army that's surrounding Jerusalem? There's several hundreds of thousands of Assyrians that are ready to bring them into slavery and kill them and to starve them to death.
This is where the destroying angel comes and just basically wipes them all out.
That's right. The destroying angel comes in, and one night they lose 185,000 soldiers, and they just pack up and leave. And it's interesting because there's this prism that they found. They call it the Taylor prism. They also call it the Sennacherib prism. And it tells the same story of the Assyrians' conquest of that whole area. But they never say that Jerusalem was destroyed, because it never was. They say he brags that he has enclosed Hezekiah like a caged bird. So they have them surrounded. But he doesn't say anything about them having to retreat and to leave, which I thought was kind of interesting. But it's nice to know that there's some historic collaboration there. Now, Hezekiah mostly was a very righteous gentleman, a king. And Isaiah tells him when he gets sick that his life will be extended by 15 years. And at the very, very end, Hezekiah does something kind of a little bit silly. Babylon takes over from Assyria. And I talked about that on our Sunday discussion, where the brutality of the Assyrians was so great that some of the provinces banded together, namely the Babylonians and the Medes, and they took them out. And so Babylon becomes the big bully on the block now. And Babylon comes to visit Hezekiah in his old age, and Hezekiah proudly shows them all the treasures that he has in his house. Isaiah is not very happy with this, and Isaiah makes a prophecy to him that says that all of these items are going to eventually be taken by Babylon. Another thing that Hezekiah does that's kind of interesting is a tunnel. And I don't know if everybody's aware of this tunnel, that if you go to Jerusalem, I was talking to my sister today. She went to Jerusalem some years ago, although at the time there were such difficulties that all of the tourist spots weren't open. But one of the big tourist attractions in Jerusalem is this tunnel that's built from the spring here all the way down to a pool at the bottom here. And the reason they did this is they covered up the spring that was outside the city gates and then brought it all the way down so that they would have water in the event of a siege. And they did this just before the siege that Hezekiah underwent. He blocks up the upper spring at the Gihon area and brings down the water. It's kind of amazing because it's 533 meters long, and they carved it out of stone with iron tools. So that would have been quite an engineering feat. And it's apparently a big tourist area, particularly in the summer, because it's so nice and cool down there. Now, the king after him is his son Manasseh. And what do we know about Manasseh?
Wicked king.
Wicked king. He's 12 years old when he takes the throne. Manasseh was this kind of spoiled teenager. Did some bad things. He did evil. He built up the high places. He made his sons to pass through fire. Do we know what that is? That's child sacrifice. And so here we have a king of Judah encouraging child sacrifice. And then there's also a tradition that states that Manasseh killed the prophet Isaiah. And so there's this wonderful painting in La Chiesa de Gesù in Rome, Italy. It's a fresco that shows Daniel, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Isaiah. And Isaiah is the guy holding the saw. He apparently hid in a tree. And so the king had them saw the tree down right through Isaiah, according to legend. Okay, then after him comes the reign of Josiah. What do we know about Josiah?
He was a good king.
He was a very good king. He started being the king when he was 8. And during his reign, the high priest discovers a book that's hidden in the temple when they're doing renovations. And when he reads what's in the book, he rends his clothes and tells the high priest to inquire of the Lord concerning what they should do about this book. Many have speculated that this was the book of Deuteronomy. Others say that it was the 5 books of Moses. And so he goes to a prophetess, and she tells him that he'll be blessed for what he's doing, but that the writing is on the wall for Judah. that they're not going to make it. A lot of scholars think that Josiah took some liberties here in rewriting parts of Deuteronomy. Nobody knows for certain, nobody was there. But the way that all of the historical books that go from Deuteronomy to the end of Second Kings have a lot of similar language as what Deuteronomy has. The reforms that he does, some are great and some are maybe not so good. We know that, for example, the Book of Mormon people didn't completely agree with some of the reforms that Josiah did, although Josiah did do a lot of good things in turning people back to the Lord. The 2 Kings 22 to 23 tells the story of Josiah, the hero. Josiah is like unto Moses, according to the author of whoever's writing 2 Kings. These are some of the reforms that he does. He gets rid of the idolatrous priests. He gets rid of the false gods that are crept into the actual temple. He stops child sacrificing. He breaks down the houses of the Sodomites. And then he even stretches into the northern kingdom and has some of the reforms go on there. And so by and large, a lot of what he did was very, very good. However, some of the things that people took exception to was that you could only perform sacrifice at the temple in Jerusalem. And that's why Lehi travels out by the Red Sea and he gets far enough away from Jerusalem, then he's able to build an altar and do his own sacrificing. Because he was outside the 3-day journey limit, that was the requirement. Anybody who lived within 3 days, which would have been all of Israel, all of the kingdom of Judah, would all have been within those 3 days, they basically had to come to Jerusalem to worship. And so Lehi had to travel outside of that in order to perform his sacrifices. And what they write about in 2 Kings is that, and like unto him was there no king before him that turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to the law of Moses, neither after him arose there any like him. So they really extol that he did some marvelous things. But unfortunately, he's slain in battle by the Egyptians, no less. And that seems kind of an unusual end to a righteous king. Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting because we're right at the time of Lehi, around that 600 BC. The northern kingdom has been taken away. The southern kingdom is now subject to Assyrian taxes. And we get a series of really, really bad kings who fluctuate back and forth between whether they're going to pay taxes or not pay taxes. And you can see that as we get into the prophets later, that they are all during this time. Okay, in chapter 24, Jerusalem is besieged and then taken by Nebuchadnezzar, kind of a stage 2. And so some of the cream of the population are taken away. This is where you get the story of Daniel being transported into Babylon. They take a lot of the very educated, the royal people, the upper crust people, and so that they have very little leadership left in Judah. At the time of this first exile, Nebuchadnezzar orders the elite citizen of Judah deported together with the most valuable treasures of the temple and the palace. Among the captives was the prophet Ezekiel, though not Jeremiah, who remained in Jerusalem. Also, before this time, of course, Lehi leaves. He's led away to the Americas. Then they rebel again. Nebuchadnezzar again besieges Jerusalem. This is where we have Zedekiah, who's captured, has his eyes poked out. Most of the people are either killed or carried away into Babylon. Some flee to Egypt. And then we have the complete destruction of Jerusalem. Temples burned, the palace is burned, all the houses are burned, and the walls are all knocked down so that there'll be no further disruptions. And it's really a sad time. Why do you think that the people felt that it would never get destroyed? Because definitely Laman and Lemuel thought that Lehi was crazy when he was prophesying that Jerusalem would be destroyed. And they basically didn't believe. The population did not believe that Jerusalem would be destroyed.
Probably thought it was such a great city that no one could touch them. It brings to mind the city of Ammonihah, where they thought the Lamanites surely couldn't attack them because they thought they were such a great nation, great city. But I'm just wondering if it was the same thing with Jerusalem.
And the Assyrians couldn't take it. So
That's
Yeah,
true.
basically 100 years earlier in 701, so this is 586, so a little bit more than 100 years, the 185,000 soldiers that were surrounding Jerusalem, and remember, all of Israel and all of Judah had been conquered and destroyed. Jerusalem was left, and then the angel of the Lord came in and killed off most of the army. And so when Lehi starts preaching that Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, the people are thinking, you're crazy. There's no way they can take this city. Not only are we too powerful, but the Lord has always protected us. The temple's here. We're the chosen people. There's no way he's going to let it happen. Little did they realize that that was based only on the righteousness of the people. The reason the Assyrians didn't take Jerusalem was the righteousness of Hezekiah, the leader, the high priest, the leaders of the area, and the people who turned to God and asked for his deliverance. Babylonians came, they didn't. They just expected it to happen again, but it didn't. Now, this all culminates in the end of First and Second Kings, or really First, Second, Third, and Fourth Kings, if you want to go that way. It serves to prove a point about kings. The wrapping up of this really is that we have to make Christ our king, that we can't really depend on earthly kings. For behold, the Spirit of the Lord hath already ceased to strive with their fathers, and they are without Christ and God in the world, and they are driven about as chaff before the wind. They were once a delightsome people, and they had Christ for their shepherd. Yea, they were led even by God the Father. But now, behold, they are led about by Satan, even as chaff is driven before the wind, or as a vessel is tossed about upon the waves without sail or anchor, or without anything wherewith to steer her. And even as she is, so are they. This is, of course, from Mormon. But the message is pretty clear. By rejecting the true king, both the Nephites and the Jews were driven about as chaff. And so we really need to learn the same lesson. Christ is the king, and that we can't really depend on others to lead us in the right direction. We have to follow what the Lord has indicated for us in the scriptures, with our prophets, to help us to stay on track. And I think more than anything else, my study of the Old Testament has taught me a dependence on the Lord more than a dependence on anybody else, because they're not dependable. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad, sometimes they're just lukewarm. The only one you can really depend on is the Savior.
Well, thanks, Carl. This is another great enlightening conversation. I really enjoyed this passage. There was some characters here like Hezekiah. Am I saying that right? Hezekiah. I'm like, I don't remember hearing about this guy before, but he was really cool, and Josiah as well, and just some of the parts of the Old Testament. I guess I just never studied hard enough.
Well, in fact, it was President Kimball that referred to King Josiah as one of the great kings.
One of the podcasts I listened to, the guy named his two sons. One was Josiah and the other one Hezekiah, because of his study of the Old Testament. Those are just two really great kings who did fabulous things to try to turn around. But despite having great leaders, it still went down the tubes.
When you think about all the kings that Judah and Israel went through, majority of them were wicked, and to have a few good kings come through, can you imagine the work that they had to do to reteach the people, to throw down, destroy the idols and everything, to get things back to where it should be?
Yeah, because they weren't just good kings, they were reformers. They were trying to reform the people.
Now, Hezekiah, when he came on the scene, they didn't even have the scriptures. There had been 50 plus years of bad kings.
All right, great thoughts, discussion. All right, well, thanks, Carl. I'll wrap this up. And thanks to everybody who will watch this recording later on. Don't forget to like it